Hey guys, Jordan Belfort here. Give you my weekly blog entry, walking on the beach again, living the life. And this is an afternoon walk. Got a little noise here from the water, so maybe I'll walk up a few feet so you can hear me better. So I got a really great topic today that I want to share with you, and it comes from a webinar that I did a few days ago. And I do webinars. I don't really do them that much, but I do one usually before I'm going to do a boot camp. And I have a boot camp coming up in the beginning of London, beginning of March in London. So I figured I always do a webinar because I get a lot of people that want to sign up, and I'll do it mostly and advertise it to be in Europe and in England, Scotland, Dublin. So anyway, the subject that I went through was this issue of certainty, but in terms of really why certainty and your ability to manage your state is so important when it comes to sales. Because sometimes when we think of certainty, it's an inner game aspect, and we don't look at it as really being part of a strategy. It's like the softer side of sales training, and in that sense, people have a tendency not to value it as much. And I just want to explain to you why your ability to trigger a state of absolute certainty is so crucial when it comes to selling. And it really comes down to, believe it or not, an actual law of physics. And I was a science major in college. I have a degree in biochemistry, and I had to study physics. And one of the mainstays of physics is what's called the Law of Thermodynamics, and that has to do with how energy flows. And the way it flows is from hot to cold. So if you have an object that's red hot and you have another object that's cold, what happens is the energy ends up flowing from the hot object to the cold object, not the other way around. That's just a basic law of nature. Well, the same thing applies in selling. At the highest level, if you've studied the straight line, and most of you, obviously have studied it in a big way if you're reading this blog, and one of the things I talk about is sales at the highest level being the transference of certainty. That's the primary emotion that you're transferring. And there are two types of certainty. We have logical certainty, which has to do with features and benefits and value proposition. Those are your primary ways of creating logical certainty. In other words, does the product fill the prospect's needs? Is it going to resolve their pain? Is it worth it in terms of compared to other products? And again, usually whatever you're selling, they're always competing products, right? So the question really is what is the proposition that makes your product or your service, your idea, more valuable? That's how you create logical certainty. Emotional certainty is created through what's called future pacing, meaning allowing the prospect to visualize and imagine himself in the future having purchased your product, using it, and feeling good, meaning their needs are met, their pain is removed, they feel like they're more in control of their life in some way. And that's really the essence of creating emotional certainty. But in terms of what's behind that is, how do you transfer that from yourself, from what you're feeling, to the prospect? Now, the straight line represents the structure, the conduit by which the certainty flows. In other words, the straight line tells you what type of certainty has to flow. So there's certainty about your product. There's certainty about yourself, meaning, are you the person that they want to do business with as a salesperson? Can they trust you? Do they see the value proposition of the long-term relationship? And are they moved emotionally? Do they feel just like, they feel great about having you in their lives, right? And then we also have the certainty for the company that stands behind the product. And we have those two types of that, the subdivisions, which is logical certainty and emotional certainty for all three. But the real question is, so the straight line represents the conduit, meaning almost the pipes through which the certainty flows. When you start a conversation, you enter a sales, right? What's called, goal-oriented communication, right? In essence, what's happening is you are in this state of absolute certainty. So imagine, you know, on a continuum, on a line of certainty, 1 represents uncertainty, where the prospect is uncertain, and 10 represents absolute certainty, where the product, you know, says, wow, this is the best thing since sliced bread, right? They love your product. They see the value. They imagine themselves in the future feeling great, no more pain. That's a 10. But the way it flows, so the conduit, essentially the pipes, that, you know, how it flows from one side to the other of the sale, that's the straight line. It's a strategy. But the actual certainty itself comes from you as this white hot object. In other words, you are absolutely certain that it comes through in every word you say, with your tonality, with your body language, and that certainty then flows down the straight line from hot to cold. So imagine the prospect enters the conversation with some predetermined level of certainty. In other words, there's always some number from 1 to 10 that the prospect is at. And that number is based on their preconceived notions, their experiences, what they've heard about the product. So let's take an iPhone, for example. So, you know, iPhone has a great reputation. People love it. You know, it's been well advertised. It's considered to be the prime phone out there, right? Smartphone. So in that case, there really isn't that much certainty that you have to move them. In other words, it's really more about the, you know, the value proposition and, you know, explaining the product in the right way, and then a little bit of future pacing. But in essence, if imagine a 1 to 10, so the prospect is probably going to already be at an 8 in terms of the level of certainty. So you're now trying to move them from an 8 to a 10. That's what you do. And the way you do that is through your language, through your tonality, right? Because you, as the salesman, if it's an iPhone, you're in an absolute 10. You know, it's the greatest phone in the world. It fills everyone's needs. It's elegant. It feels good in your hand. There's an emotional connection to the phone. So when people go into an Apple store to buy an iPhone, the chances are much better than not that they're already at a very high level of certainty. However, let's say you're selling a phone that's really more of a, you know, a questionable brand, like one of the, you know, the brands from Asia that are, or, you know, I think one of them starts with an H, Highwire, something, whatever it is, right? And it's a good phone. It's a functional phone. It does pretty much what an iPhone does. Yet, when people go into a store to think about buying that phone, they might be at a 3 or a 4, simply because they haven't heard of it. The brand isn't as strong. There's no emotional connection. And in that case, you're trying to move them from, let's say, a 3 or a 4 to a 10. How do you do that? Well, the straight line represents that, essentially that conduit of how you do that in terms of, you know, how it flows. But it has to start with you, meaning you have to be absolutely certain. If you're not absolutely certain, there's nothing to flow from one side of the sale to the other. So now we're left at this point of how do you create absolute certainty? Well, you know, one of the things I teach when I have more time in my boot camp actually is this process called olfactory anchoring, using your sense of smell to trigger this state of absolute certainty. I know it sounds a bit wacky, but it is incredibly, incredibly effective. Now, if you can't attend the boot camp, I want to make sure you get some value out of this. So the way we create certainty is by visualizing ourselves making the perfect sale before we walk in the door, before someone comes in our store. Like right before the sale starts, we want to visualize the perfect sale unfolding. And then we run it through our brain, right? You have the ability to do that. And you imagine the sale playing out with a perfect conclusion. Makes you feel great. And that's how you start the process of triggering absolute certainty. Now, with the olfactory anchoring, we take it to a whole new level. We use this process that I created that it just gets you to this level of absolute white hot certainty, which then comes through your body language, through your tonality, and through some certain language patterns that you say. And most of you study the straight lines, you know what some of those language patterns are, right? And that's how we, transfer the certainty from us to the prospect. Yet we can't do that unless we are absolutely certain. So the lesson today for this week's blog is that you have to start the conversation in this state of absolute certainty, of feeling absolutely confident, feeling clear about what you're talking about. No, overwhelm in your voice, no self-doubt, And again, the way we do this at the high level, you know, and I really hope, you know, those of you who can attend the boot camp, it's in London coming up, you know, we're going to go through how you do that, how you get yourself in a state of absolute certainty. If you can't make it, hey, then, you know, you got to learn this visualization process of running the perfect sail through your mind, feeling and seeing and you know, essentially mapping out in your mind's eye this perfect sail occurring. And that gets you close to this state of absolute certainty. And remember, when I talk about absolute certainty, I'm not talking about this, you know, you're jumping and screaming and, you know, oh my God, it's so great. That's obnoxious and doesn't work. I'm talking about this bottled enthusiasm where it's just below the surface and they sense this energy and this power, and that's what you're transferring to your prospect. So that's the lesson for today, this ability to essentially get yourself into a state of certainty, and this law of thermodynamics where hot flows to cold, which is exactly what's happening as you use the straight line. You're transferring your white hot certainty to someone who's at a lower level, essentially a colder level of certainty, and that's how you close the deal. And remember, of course, we have this issue of action threshold, right, which is that level that each individual, and it's unique to an individual, what they have to be at in terms of what level of certainty they have to be at before they buy. And everyone's a bit different. The easier people to sell to, those low action threshold people, they can be at a lower level of certainty, and the high action threshold people, they have to be absolutely damn certain, you know, damn sure of it. So again, this is your blog entry for this week. Good talking to you. I'm heading out to Germany this afternoon, or actually later this evening. From there I go to Spain, and I have some consulting to do in Germany, and I have actually a live event there, a one-day event. And then from there, from Spain, visiting my daughter there, and from Spain I'm going to London for some consulting. Then I go home, and then I go back to London at the beginning of the month, and that's my schedule. So I hope to see you guys very soon. If not, make sure that you, as much as possible, get yourself into this state of absolute certainty, and then use the straight line to transfer that certainty in a very effective, elegant manner. Take care. This is my life on the beach, and it doesn't suck. Take care.